Welcome to the Friday webinar series organized by the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. As you are aware, it's a recent think tank which we have set up in 2018. The focus of the think tank, the aim is to provide research-based policy advice and to work in the policy space in socio-economic areas. It is in this context that for nearly a year and a half, we've been organizing on important policy issues webinars. And these webinars, which span for nearly 90 minutes, cover topics across the spectrum of economics and socio-economic issues. We have been very privileged to have speakers from India and from abroad. We have also had the privilege of having two Nobel laureates speak to us in economics, and I understand quite a few of the ones who spoke to us are almost potential Nobel laureates. So the webinar series has been very successful in bringing policy-oriented issues and some suggestions from the academic world to the notice of the policymakers. It is exactly in that context that today we have a seminar. And on this seminar, we are going to be discussing about the garments, the global value chains. To chair this seminar today, we have Dr. Lakhwinder Singh. Dr. Lakhwinder Singh is Emeritus Professor in Economics, Commerce and Management, Khalsa College, Punjabi University, Patiala. Earlier, Dr. Singh has been Professor and Head, Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala, where he has founded Center for Development Economics and Innovation Studies. Dr. Lakhwinder Gill is a very popular academician, published 9 books and more than 100 articles in various reputed journals and leading national dailies. I have been associated with some of the research that he has done, and I have heard him speak. Extremely effective research that he conducts. He has held several visiting positions at Yale University, Seoul National University, Korea. His specialization is development economics. He has worked extensively on Punjab economy. He has worked on innovation systems and regional economics. He has teaching experience of more than 32 years and has successfully supervised 20 PhD students. With this, I invite Dr. Gill to chair the session, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Charan Singh ji, for saying kind words which I do not deserve, and giving me an opportunity to be a participant on this very important book discussion that is going to take place in the next 1.5 hours. So this book, Reverse Subsidies in Global Monopsony, Capitalism, is very timely book, since from the last 30 years period of time, India in particular and large number of less developed countries in general have introduced the program of liberalization, privatization and globalization, invited the large number of multinational companies. If you look at the World Investment Report, you will find that normally each day one decision has been taken across the board by the countries, or more than one decision, in terms of inviting FDI for entering into global value chains. So the public policy which has been striving to enter into global value chains, and usually it is being given an impression that global value chains are going to make the development of the less developed countries in general, and you will find that they will provide an opportunity to catch up with the Western world. That does mean that you are going to have a higher rate of growth of the economy because of the global value chains. However, the governments of various countries of the world have given a lot of space, both in policy as well as in incentive systems, to the various global companies, especially in terms of introducing flexibility in the labor markets. as well as not, as well as remain relaxed or relatively less stringent in terms of environmental policies. So, if we look at this particular book, this book is written by 7 very well-known economists as well as social persons who have been continuously engaged in the issues related to the aftermath of the globalization policies and all that. So there are 12 chapters in this book, but bringing out the less known discussions which was expected to take place but would never taken place because the dominance of the global value chains in terms of its positivity has been recently challenged even by the established theorists. But I will not develop a lot on this because book is very rich treasure to deal with the issues of injustice, especially done to the labor, more specifically to the gender, and then you'll find that the exploitation of the environment. So I think that when the title comes out to be reverse subsidies, I think that still this book has a positivity aspect, more in a way highlighted instead of looking into the typical Marxian style, the theory of value and exploitation. So it comes quite close to that kind of debate, but you will find that bringing it very nicely, the various facets of starting from you will find that the cotton production to actually the manufacturing of cotton, providing garments at various levels from India to the various global value chains. So, in this, with these words, I would like to, be a watchman as has been appointed by Professor Chan Singh, and would request each one of the speakers, the first 2 speakers who are the authors of the book, they should speak little less in 10 minutes each, and we will provide 20 minutes each to the 2 very specific speakers who have read the book and would like to, argue the good points as well as some kind of critical issues which perhaps future researchers have to look into it. So, with these words, I'm grateful to Professor Charan Singh and his EGROW Foundation for especially picking up this particular book because this is highly valued book, requires to be debated, discussed, because its policy relevance is very, very important. And some of the suggestions which has been given are worth consideration by the Indian government. So with these words, I would like to request Professor Sukhpal Singh, before he should speak. I know that he is a very well-known agribusiness professor in the country. Dr. Sukhpal Singh is professor and former chairperson, Center for Management in Agriculture, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, Gujarat. Formerly Director General, Center for Research in Industrial and in Rural and Industrial Development, Chandigarh, and a former professor and head Agricultural Economic Research Unit, Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi. He has earned his PhD from Isaac Bangalore and MPhil from CDS GNU, New Delhi. He is a founding co-editor with me in the Millennial Asia. It is an international journal of Asian studies. He has a large contribution in academic terms, 14 books, including this one, and 150 research papers in the professional top class national international journals. And he has been very regular contributor to the newspapers where he has contributed more than 70 news articles in the newspapers and the magazines. So he has also co-authored with me the book COVID-19 Pandemic and Economic Development has been brought out by Palgrave Macmillan very recently and has a lot of visiting positions internationally, which is very difficult to state. So I would request Professor Sukhpal Singh to kindly speak for 10 minutes only. Welcome, Professor Sukhpal.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lakhwinder Singh. Let me thank Professor Charan Singh and the EGROW Foundation for hosting this event. I also welcome the discussants, Professor Vasavi and Professor Selim Raihan from Bangladesh, and my co-authors. I see some of them here, and many friends among the participants in this discussion. I'm just trying to share the slides, but there is some issue. And I have a power off here now. So bad beginning. Oh, it's come back. Okay.
Sukhpal, we are not able to listen to you.
Sorry, there is
Now
this sharing thing is not happening. I don't know. Do I need to give access or something? It says allow WebEx to share your content. So I don't know. It is just getting into something.
Vivek, can you
I'm not a very regular user of WebEx.
Yeah.
Vivek, kindly quickly look into it.
Yes, sir. Click on allow.
Let me go ahead without the slides, perhaps, to save time.
Yes, I think that is a better option.
So what I will do is I'll just give you a summary of the first half of the book. Yeah. And Dr. Rahul, who will be the second author speaker, will do the rest of the half book. Now the book is titled Reverse Subsidies in Global Monopsony Capitalism, Gender, Labor and Environmental Justice in Garment Value Chains. I would just like to make a few clarifications to begin with. One is that when you are using the term value chains, we don't necessarily mean it in very narrow terms in a linear fashion. We're basically referring to the larger issues of global production and trade networks or global value systems to a large extent. We know that there are many stakeholders in a production and trade system, which is beyond just linear participants of suppliers, buyers, and others. It could be state, it could be NGOs, it could be many other stakeholders in a chain or network. Though we have subtitled it the garment value chain, any kind of value chains, which our focus on, I will explain as subsidies. We look at the value of the environmental resources and issues around us whenever production or trade. We are concept of Monopsony in a minute. We also embed value in the larger context of only the household, but also the environment, which is generally not done. People analyze the chain, they really do all the time. They basically look at what happens within the chain to different participants in terms of gains and losses. But we are opening up the chain in terms of a network and saying that what happened to the other things which support some of these production and trade systems. And we are presenting reverse subsidies as a form of, as the chair said, as a kind of exploitation, which happens because of the monopsony capitalism operation in these modern trade networks. And we term it as injustice because it really happens at the cost of many smaller participants or stakeholders. So when we say reverse subsidies, what we mean by this is that generally subsidies are seen in terms of helping the producers. So that is how we look at subsidies. Then you have different agencies talking about merit goods, merit subsidies and demerit subsidies and so on. What should be subsidized, what should not be subsidized. But in the context of global trade, north-south relations and trade and production networks. We are saying that these subsidies are reversed in the sense that producers and workers are subsidizing buyers and brands and other drivers of these chains and networks, that whatever is being sold globally, it's being sold at low prices because somebody is not being paid their due share in terms of production costs, whether for farmers or wages, minimum wages for workers, or any such extraction which happens because of the relations of production which this system provides to the drivers of the chains, who can be supermarket buyers, who can be brands, global brands, and so on. So we term it as injustice because you cannot be buying something from somebody which is not even giving a decent livelihood to that stakeholder or that entity. It could be wages be below living wages. It could be farmers' compensation, which is below living incomes for farmers. And so we're saying when somebody does not pay the full cost of an input, that is a subsidy. That producer or that worker is subsidizing the buyer of their services. And that's a reverse subsidy for us in this book. And this is also not coming only from these households and workers and farmers, but also from the larger environment, which is as an externality, that some resources are being used, water is being used, land is being degraded, air is being polluted. So all that is an externality of the operations of chains and networks, which is also a reverse subsidy, because all the burden of this kind of externality is being borne by local populations and local stakeholders in local natural resource systems and so on. So this is how we define or categorize reverse subsidies as a form of exploitation in the global production networks. We also distinguish between sites of extraction of value, which is generally seen as at manufacturer level, and capture of value, which happens at the brand level globally, because the brands design new products and sell and market new products, create demand for new products. So it's not just extraction which is important, it's also capture of value, which further perpetuates injustice in the whole chain or the network. And that perpetuation of injustice happens because the capture of value is captured by the brand and done by the brand because of the monopsony relations they have. When we say monopsony, we are referring to, as against monopoly, the brands already have monopoly as single sellers. But when we call them monopsony players, then we are saying that there are also a few players who source these products from developing country producers. So they also have monopsony on, but when they buy from their suppliers, garment manufacturers and others, and who in turn have this kind of power with the raw material suppliers or with the workers when they engage them in this kind of production system. So when we say that it's a monopsony capitalism, now there have been other works on monopsony, whether it's Ashok Kumar's recent work or our own co-author Devnath recently, a couple of papers. Work. So we are basically saying that this is basically about relationship between employers and workers. That's others have been saying that basically a relation which is within the national or domestic economy. But we are saying that it is beyond that, because today in the age of global value chain, we are basically looking at two-way monopsony relationship between brands and contract manufacturers who are suppliers, and suppliers and their labor. Yeah, so it happens at two levels, not just one level, because we are talking about brand-based production and trade. The examples could be, for example, Zara or H&M or Marks and Spencer has thousands of contract manufacturers who supply them garments. So there are large number of suppliers, but only a few buyers. That creates a situation of monopsony. Yeah, let me say monopoly when there are too many sellers. One seller and too many buyers, but here there are too many suppliers and only a few buyers. So that gives them the power to extract extra value out of the efforts of workers and suppliers, because there is a low elasticity of supply of contract manufacturers. They don't have much leeway as against very high elasticity for brands and drivers of the networks. So that is what leads to this kind of exploitation because of the relationship of monopsony in the whole. Now, this thing is embedded in the larger context of the society and the environment, because it's not just the factory which is the source of exploitation, but factory is supported by the household. and factory and household both are embedded in the local context of environmental and natural resources. So the global value chain drivers extract labor power as an input from the household and pay back wages to the workers. And this is another change. If you look back into work of Samir Amin and others and so on, and use these value chains use natural resources, environmental resources like clean water or effluent treatment and its disposal in a way that this imposes certain more externalities on the local stakeholders in these chains and networks.
So, Paul,
yeah.
So, Paul, your time
so
is
I will just come to just 2 minutes more.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that okay?
Okay.
I'm just concluding now, saying that these brands extract this set of subsidies, which we call reverse subsidies, because they have the monopsony power. So they exploit both labor, which have no bargaining power, and the environmental resources, which are nobody's and everybody's in a local situation like of India. And these monopsony relations give these brands the power to capture the surplus in the whole production and trade process. And therefore, we are concerned with two types of reverse subsidies: labor and the environment to brands, and at the larger level, subsidies from the global south to the global north in terms of larger trade relations. Now my co-author Rahul will take you further into the empiricism of the book in terms of the specifics of gender, labor, and environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sukhpal. You have given the framework of the book which has been used, and very, very precisely you have tried to convince everybody that your framework is just to understand the processes of the global value chain and the surplus transfer which has been done over a period of time. Thank you very much. So now we would like to have S. Rahul. Rahul is Assistant Professor, School of Management and Labor Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He's a data enthusiast and works on both micro and macro databases. He specializes in designing research studies and analytics and empirics of the same. His research interests align with labor, value chains, public policy, and governance. So, Dr. Rahul, welcome, and you kindly speak 10 minutes. Please unmute. Please unmute.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the space and the opportunity to present. I am happy and humble at the same time to have this opportunity. So I'm getting into the presentation. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Rahul, your voice is breaking.
Sorry, Sukhpal.
Your voice is not clear. It's breaking.
Am I audible? I mean,
yes. No.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, how do brands extract values or reverse subsidies? So subsidies, as Sukhpal has explained, from labor and from environment are extracted in the manufacturing of garments. And we are looking at monopsony relationships, and it is a monopsony relationship that the brands or the lead firms with the contracted manufacturers or a plethora of suppliers enable the brands to capture the excess profit in the form of these subsidies. Thus, we are concerned with reverse subsidies in two senses. One, from labor and environment to the branch. So a part of their or a large share of their profit is actually subsidized by the labor who is producing the garment, and also from the environment which actually produces a raw material, and also is a major part of the production process of the garments is subsidizing the profits. And also the global south, in a larger political sense, the global south is actually subsidizing the global north economy in creating these subsidies. Now, how can we extend the analysis of GVCs into this sphere? So our answer is to have an empirical study of the sites where these reverse subsidies are extracted. So we need to study the factory, the household, and the environment. we have also analyzed the micro data on garment workers, firms, households, and that will set in the context for the larger empirical primary study. So an original empirical research was conducted between 2016 to 21 across different research projects at different locations. And we had different research partners and academia, from civil society organizations and consultants who were part of the process. Yeah. So now we will look at how the reverse subsidy flow from each of these sectors, from factory, from household, and from environment. Coming to factories, how is factory a site of extraction linked to the structure of GVC? So the firms or the suppliers or the contracted manufacturers manage unstable orders with relatively very low margins. And what will the firms do? They will displace this low margins or the to the risk onto their workforce, which is a labor force. That will result in precarious employment condition in terms of temporary work or casual work, high production targets, wages below minimum wages, and extended overtime, extended hours of working, and also gender related violences, sexual abuses, and forced labor, and so on. Now, this graph forms the context for this. If you look at, from a primary survey, we have categorized the firms into two. We had firms which was technologically driven and firms which was labor driven. And when we looked at the margins which they have earned over a period of years, we have seen that there is a considerable decline in margins, both for technology driven firms and labor driven firms. So there is no incentive for a firm in the supplier countries to actually technologically upgrade. Or why they are technologically upgrading? Technological upgradation is happening. Why they are technologically upgrading to reduce their factory, the wholesale price or the price in which they are selling it to the brands. So the cost of technological upgradation is actually to reduce the price rather than to increase the margin. So who is gaining benefit out of it? It's a brand or the lead firms who are gaining benefit out of technological upgradation, whatever it is happening. So there is no incentive for the firms for this upgradation to happen. Now, how are these subsidies flowing? So the firms are technologically upgrading to reduce the FOB prices. So the lead firms are buying labor power below a living wage, and that forms a reverse subsidy. And why living wage is important? We see living wage as a cost of production and reproducing labor. And that will include women's unpaid work and reproductive labor that is carried in the household. So the household, the women, and the work which a woman actually does in the household actually has a social reproduction angle, and that produces the worker for your factory. So this was some empirics which we have done, looked at wages in a comparison between wages clusters, and then it was very clear that the wages paid were even below minimum wages, and it was nowhere close to the living wages. So how are these subsidies extracted? So the extraction of the subsidies, how it functions is there are extractive contracting practices. The brands have extractive contracting practices with the suppliers, thereby they create a sticky floor for the prices, thereby reducing the margins. Hence, the wages are paid below cost of production. And we have seen instances of body mining where the workers' bodies, especially women workers' bodies, are treated as disposable items, which is overused and discarded. And the average age of women in the garment factories is around 35, 40. You don't see women beyond 35. So that is how the subsidies are extracted at factory level, one. And now we will look at household, particularly rural household, how the rural household subsidizes the profits of the bigger brands. When the wages are below cost of production or reproduction of labor, that is social reproduction, the cost of that is borne elsewhere. And this cost is unpaid. and the transfer of resources is a subsidy from the household.
2 minutes, Rahul, 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 more slides, yes. So what are these subsidies? The supply of goods and services from rural economy. Basically, rural economy is actually supporting or bearing the cost of the wages being low. And we have seen the case of circular migration in garment production hubs or the mass reverse migration to the rural areas during COVID-19, where the rural India has actually absorbed the shock of absorbed the employment shock that was created. Rather, it was not the larger brands. So the lead firm failure to pay the margins sufficient for a supplier factory to provide for social security, healthcare, and family savings. Also, the lead firm's failure to pay for tax contributions in the production countries in terms of cess, so thereby weakening the tax base for a social safety net from a governance point of view. In the environment, how is environment acting as a so factories and cotton cultivation extract environmental services, and local communities in the production area and the downstream subsidize the lead firms on the GVC by bearing the cost of the depleted or polluted environmental resources. So we have instances of rivers turning black both in Tirupur and Dhaka, and the cleanup of this environmental damage is mostly seen as a local matter, and it has to be borne by the local governments. So how are these subsidies extracted? The lead firms do not require to pay margins sufficient to cover the environmental cost which they are creating for the subsidy. So they don't have to pay anything for the environmental cost. Now, how can we eliminate these reverse subsidies? These are certain suggestions which we are bringing up. So a brand responsibility on the reverse subsidy has to be is one of the strategy. The supplier responsibility, that the suppliers have to engage in technical and management upgradation to increase their bargaining power in the value chain. Collective action by the workers, address the unequal bargaining power between workers and factory through collective action, and ethical consumer and shareholder actions. There should be a call for the brands to shift from the extraction paradigm and shift towards a right-oriented paradigm where they will sell responsible goods in the market. Yeah. So if operationalized to account for actual cost of production, and the emerging human rights due diligence framework can be a powerful incentive for the brands to shift. So basically you create an ethical trading or ethical business practice in the final market, and that can actually eliminate or address the reverse subsidies which are happening. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahul, for sticking to time and very well explaining the mechanism through which reverse subsidies are being extracted, and policy mechanism you have tried to put forward that can be used to alleviate the situation. Thank you very much. Now we have enough feedback from the authors, and we will shift to the readers of the book, and especially the first speaker is Professor Vasavi. I think she is a very famous social anthropologist, hardly needs any introduction, and I directly would like to request her to make a presentation on the book.
Thank you for having me on this panel. Let me begin by congratulating all the authors for this excellent compilation, which is important not only because it highlights reverse subsidies which are never spoken about, especially in the context where competitive populism has meant a delivery or a deployment of a whole range of what are called freebies to people, and there are now discussions about its fiscal viability or the long-term impact of these freebies. But very often what is delivered by the working class or by marginal regions is never factored in. So this book fills that gap. So again, congratulations for highlighting this. What I'd like to do is not summarize the book because both Rahul and Sukhpal have done a very good job. I'd like to take a more sociological overview and frame this book in terms of three questions, which are, what is the academic contribution of this book? Secondly, what are the new trends in the establishment of the garment industry across India, and therefore the implications for different kinds of workers and the working class? And thirdly, drawing again from the book, which is at the end a kind of suggestions, is to look for what are the possibilities of transformative change which can shift from this reverse subsidies to a more equitable social justice paradigm. So to start with the first one, I want to say academically, the book is gives you a good review of what globalized economies, especially global value chains, which privilege northern economic rationale and profits over southern working conditions and life opportunities are about. It unpacks these details from good field-based studies, both in India and in Bangladesh. But it also tells us how a neoclassical economics that promotes economic growth, or what is quote unquote development paradigms, are really based on an excessive valuation of certain parameters, which are primarily, of course, profit, but which overlook and I think undervalue certain parameters which are about not only living wages, but also life opportunities for workers. So I think in that sense, this book has the potential, although it does not address it directly, it has the potential to contribute to a growing body of literature, which is not only critical of neoclassical economics, but also is calling for alternative economics to be built. For example, the whole school of degrowth economics that looks at going beyond growth, especially GDP, etc. Or for the new ones which are talking about circular economies, or which I would later elaborate on for new kinds of economic establishments which overcome the divides between the urban and industrial and the rural and agrarian, etc. So I think it also gives us, it more particularly provides us certain details and possibilities in which the hegemony of purely economic logic can be questioned, especially its market orientation. The book cites Karl Polanyi, who wrote The Great Transformation, in which he cautioned about the rising capitalism's ability to focus only on the market at the great sacrifice of a variety of societies. And I think this is very important because for so long, for almost 2 centuries, all societies, all domains, sectors have had to become subordinate to the economy. Everywhere the economy is seen as the god, in which a particular kind of economy becomes the overarching rubric under which everything else has to be fitted in, squeezed, accommodated, and we know what the results are. More particularly, I think at a time when we are seeing 2 great disruptions taking place all over the world, it's time for such kind of economic establishments and economic practices and the theories behind it to be questioned. And these disruptions are, first of all, the very extent and worldwide depletion of natural resources, which has been now exacerbated by global warming, which are also interlinked very closely. Therefore, the need for much more ecological sensitivity to all economic activities. Second one is the economic crisis itself, where the crisis of advanced capitalism, all the fault lines are very, very visible. Now with the onset of the war in the Ukraine, we're seeing this has also an extension of what capitalist interventions do. And therefore, again, calling for different modes. For example, today there was a discussion about how all countries need to be much more self-reliant and therefore not be completely hooked into global economies, because Ukraine is telling us this new lesson for the 21st century, etc. So therefore, I would say one of the key contributions this book would make is to how must non-economic parameters be prioritized and valorized, and therefore much more holistic approaches and perspectives are required. I would also say that this book, although again it doesn't mention it, but something that I've been working on is that it's all the details, whether it's Sukhpal's details about cotton cultivation in Punjab, Padmani's about Tirupur, how the garment industry was set up in this quote unquote backward area and the devastating ecological effect it's had. All of them indicate the extent to which rural agrarian India is adversely integrated into the mainstream urban, industrial, and now globalizing economies. It's adverse in the sense that those terms are negative or are not are at disadvantages to workers and to the regions in which these industries or work sites are set up. So it's a depletion not only of labor power at below living wage cost, it's a depletion of natural resources, which is irreversible. It's also a depletion of their savings because of the inadequate or the excessive financialization that comes from great centers of the capitalist engine as such. So in integrating such areas into the larger urban industrial globalized economies, we see deep separations taking place. First of all, it is the separation of ecology from economy, which is very clear in agriculture, but we see it in these cases where there is complete insensitivity to the long-term sustainability of ecological resources or to the base itself, and therefore where pollution, abuse, excessive extraction, etc., are legitimized. Very well explicated in the case of both the Buriganga in Bangladesh and Noyal in Tamil Nadu. It is also an example of adverse integration where there is a separation of production from reproduction. In the cases where typically garment workers were migrants from rural areas who become workers, both seasonal and circular workers in the garment industries, we see the extent to which many of them would have had to leave their families behind in the rural areas. But in times of exigencies, as then the book explains, when the COVID was set in, when they were retrenched or when they were literally abandoned by the factories that employed them, there is no security, there is no safety net, they return back to their homes. So it is the home, the family, the village then again becomes the site of the new economies of care and therefore also that of reproduction. So I think these two kinds of separations really are what highlight for us the extent to which deep forms of exploitation are built into this and the ways in which the kinds of reverse subsidies, which the book details very well, also take place and which are not recognized in typical conventional economic reckoning or in the grand kind of vision documents that states and the centers make. For example, vision document that most recently even Niti Aayog has been making. So I think it's the integrate, but for example, the precarity of garment workers in these sites, typically in the metropolitan region, the book does not extend into that, to make those interlinks. It's not only that when they lose jobs, they go back home, but for example, some years ago, about 5 years ago, there was a very interesting book on the surrogate mother industry in Bangalore. This is before the industry was declared illegal and shut down. The study showed that a large number of the surrogate mothers in the Bangalore, what is called baby producing factories, were actually former garment workers. They were women who had got exhausted from the garment industry or who wanted a little bit more money, who wanted rest because in these surrogate care centers, they would just be fed and, for 9 months till they delivered the baby. And therefore they saw this as another option. Instead of working at the factory, this is another. So the womb has also a factory that was made, but again, an undervaluation of women's labor power there. And of course, women's own bodies as great sites of exploitation. So I think it is in this context that we also need to look at issues. I know this was not in the scope of the book, so I don't, it's not a critique at all of the book, but from my own observations, I want to extend the second frame, which is what are the new trends in the establishment of the garment industries? And I want to say I really am not a specialist in this. I have not studied it closely. But in the region that I live in now, in a rural area, 70 kilometers from Mysore, about 180 kilometers from Bangalore, it was an old former it was an area where there was not only cotton grown, but silk weaving was very important. There was a very thriving and rich silk weaving center. It was second only to Kanchipuram, but it was destroyed by the turn of the 20th century itself by the British, and therefore right now there are only graveyards of the silk industry there. But in its place, over the last decade, several garment factories have come into various villages. And this I notice is a trend. I spoke with somebody because when I read this book, I thought I should check on this data. This is only anecdotal, is their thing. It's true that now the garment industry is moving really out into the rural areas to capture cheaper land. For example, Karnataka's new Land Amendment Act makes it very easy for anyone to purchase land, including agricultural land anywhere, and set up industries. So large numbers, whatever they are, of garment factories are being set up in these areas. Labor again is cheaper. They don't have to house them in factories or think about housing. Women and men are moving from their villages, being taken in buses, or they hire their own vehicles or travel to these sites. More particularly, there's less regulation because the labor, department of all those regulations, they're away from such supervision. So therefore, violations of timing, of conditions, etc., are much more easier. And more particularly, what we heard, especially since the COVID lockdown, and then now again when some of the factories are on, which is the kind of abuses of women is much more rampant because there is no unionizing at all. The workers are extremely fragmented. They come from small villages and hamlets. They don't stay together. Unionizing is nearly impossible. And also there is lack of knowledge about what they're entitled to, of their rights as workers, etc. So therefore, what we are seeing is this establishment of garment industries in these rural belts, which then compound some of the reverse subsidies that the authors of this book talk about. It's really compounded in the sense it's very blatantly much more than what you would see in the context of the urban areas. So in that, what the impact of some of this is at least threefold, and this is something that I have been documenting and noticing much more than the actual factory, which is small and marginal farmers, especially women from farming households, for where income from farms are very inadequate, as all studies show for all India, even in this region. It is they who actually then seek this kind of employment, which is very quick. After just 3-4 months of training, they can get a full-time job, etc. It is they who are then being absorbed into the rural garment industry. They see it as job opportunities, but it is also accounting for and enhancing the de-agrarianization of the rural, of the countryside. Many families that don't want to be in agriculture anymore are seeing this as a way. It is one of the factors in which what is called non-farm rural employment, NFRE, is also coming from the garment and allied industries. As I mentioned earlier, it's the lack of regulation means precarity. For example, we've heard about the kind of very abusive language that is used against women. I met a few women who, when I asked them why they left, they said, that actually the pay was quite good, 8,000 rupees a month, which is a lot for them. But we have never been spoken to like this in our lives. So it is really not only gendered kind of violence, but also a kind of cultural violence, which is very unbearable to many of them, and therefore it makes their working life not only precarious but also subjects them to deep forms of humiliation, which are really forms of injustice also. So third,
five more minutes.
Yeah, that's more than enough for me. Thirdly, I just want to say how what kind of transformative changes are possible. The book highlights, and Rahul kind of summarized this, which is about state regulation, increasing taxes, workers putting more pressure, etc. All of which are important. But I thought as alternatives, could the idea of reviving the old linkages between cotton or any textile production, for example, it could be jute or even silk, to the older heritage artisan kind of craftsmanship, to smaller, localized, decentralized, localized structures of production, in which ownership can also be both on cooperative or in some kind of new kinds of organization structures which are more non-hierarchical. For example, taking the case from, when Europe shifted from fast food to slow food, can there be ways in which this fast fashion, large macro globalized industries shift into much more localized artisanship kind of production of clothes, in which there is both sustainability but also equity built into it? For example, the ways in which the Kutch embroidery workers, that has been revitalized in some ways, in new ways where the workers themselves actually gain much of the profit. It's happening in other small parts of India. Near Mysore, there is again a Khadi setup that is completely run on a cooperative basis, looking at old skills but new kinds of ownership patterns, which then those new parameters would come in. So going beyond this, I just want to say, in looking at these alternative imaginaries, I want to conclude by saying that although this is a book on economics and providing ground for the very hegemonic neoclassical economics, a broader perspective about what work, life, justice are is something that needs to be done. I have just finished reading this book. I don't know if you can see this. It is by Jeremy Seabrook. It's a wonderful book called The Song of the Shirt, Cheap Clothes Across Continents and Centuries, where he does an excellent comparative study of how in the 18th century it was the disembedding of Bengal, large parts, which is of course now, the core of it was what is now Bangladesh, and other parts of India. It was disembedding of the handloom industry there that led to the establishment of the textile industry in Europe, especially in England. And he looks at how in the 20th century, again, there were reverse took place when those, Manchester, Lancashire and all were emptied out, and then these mills have now gone back in different kinds of avatars. So I want to conclude by his last passage, which is really, what should we do? How should we think about these issues? To quote him, will the industrial paradigm and its global market, which gouge the treasures of the earth, the harvest of its land and waters, with such ferocity continue to intensify their pressure in the name of development? And if so, will large tracts of the world become scarcely habitable? Will the market become cosmos, leaving no alternative, no culture, no civilization, no other way of living outside its constantly expanding frontier? What new demands will be made of us, we who were the spinners and weavers of Bengal, the cotton operatives of Lancashire, the garment workers of Dhaka, the rag pickers of the world? What shape will that culture take, and who will benefit from the apparently infinite pliability of cultivators turned workers? Workers who have become cultivators once more, and cultivators transformed who have now become servicers of globalism? Or will the resourcefulness of humanity demand a new and more ample relationship with material resources, one that does not continuously deplete the reservoirs of human energy, nor exhaust the limited treasures of a wasting planet? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vasavi, for bringing out some basic characteristics of the book, putting into the anthropological perspective and bringing out the sharp alternatives which are already existing or evolving. And I think that especially the issue of the new organizational forms which are maybe cooperative, or the kind of forms which are relatively more less exploitative and more enhancing the income of the grassroots workers and artisans. That is a very important perspective. You have added value to the book. Thank you very much. And now we will shift to, I invite Dr. Selim Raihan for, he's waiting for a long period of time. So I would like to just introduce and welcome Professor Selim Raihan. He's a professor at the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. Bangladesh, and the Executive Director of the South Asian Network on Economic Modeling. He holds a PhD from the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Professor Raihan is an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. He's an alumnus of the Harvard University's program on cutting edge of development thinking. He possesses vast expertise in empirical research on the important topics like international trade, economic growth, poverty, labor market, macroeconomic policies, political economy, and climate change issues. Uh, he has also specializes in global computable general equilibrium models. That is very, very important. And he's the editor of Thinking Aloud and consultant to almost all the international organizations. Welcome, Professor Rehan. Now 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, yes.
Okay. No, thank you. And I must thank the organizers for inviting me. I think this is an excellent discussion so far. And also, I'm glad that I was kind of invited to discuss on this book. So this book on reverse subsidies in global monopsony capitalism, gender, labor, and environmental injustice in garment value chain, I thought it was an excellent work. Especially it is highly relevant in the context of the countries where we are in now, in Bangladesh and of course in India. And of course, when we are talking about discussing on the industrialization process in the developing countries, so we know that the textile and clothing is is among the first set of industries when capitalism actually starts developing and progressing. And the kind of challenges it also bring with it, especially with the very core issue of the labor. And I'm really glad that the way the authors, they have brought the related issues of living wages, labor subsidies, and especially the gender perspective and the exploitative nature of this of the use of this labor. And also in one of the specific chapter where they looked at the household as a production site, where the home workers and child laborers, especially the very importance of the unpaid labor. I think all these add to the very rich discussion to this very important topic. And finally, on this environmental cost of success, I think that was kind of one very added, an excellent element to this whole discussion. So again, I must congratulate. I think I was really, very, very benefited, while reading this book, though it's long, but I tried to complete this work, and it was really, I would say that not very difficult to read. It's lucid, and also it's very, very informative. I would like to actually have my discussion I would not really try to repeat what my earlier very distinguished speakers, they have already discussed about the books, presented two authors, they actually presented the content of the book, and the very distinguished discussant, she also elaborated some of the very important aspects of the book. But I thought that I could add some value to this discussion by discussing on the perspective from Bangladesh, as well as some of the things which I thought that probably these things, were not addressed in the book, or it can be addressed in the future. Some of the missing issues, and which I think very, very important. And drawing from my own research, actually, one of the works which I have done on the institutional diagnostic and especially the political economy analysis of Bangladesh's development, and one of the chapters is on these ready-made garments. And the whole volume is actually coming up from CUP this year, later this year. This is the institutional diagnostic bound. So I'll be talking mostly from that perspective. So while I was mentioning that, I found there are some missing elements, and which can actually complete the story, in my view. That what I thought when the authors on the book, they talked about the monopsony, the global monopsony on the one hand, and the labor on the other hand, labor in the national countries, in the countries. I thought that there was less emphasis on the middle part, especially the importance of the role played by the business elite and the political elite in these countries. The reason I'm saying in Bangladesh that, in Bangladesh, especially the role played by the business elite, especially those who are related to the ready-made garments factory. We call them ready-made garments, especially RMG. I'll try to use this word RMG more often from now. That when this RMG actually, and it has a very strong, representative, their owners and especially the exporters, strong presence in the economic front, especially their role as the business elite, and the kind of supporting political elite. So I think that role and I think that discussion, especially the political economy discussion on that particular perspective, how they actually make the link between this global monopsony and the labor, and this kind of exploitative nature of this labor. I think their role probably was not much discussed. Actually, my research looked into their role, and probably I thought that if I can share these things, can actually shed some more interesting lights to this discussion. When you talk about this ready-made garments, the RMG sector, so I think it came in Bangladesh as a kind of what is being cited as the RMG model of export success. Especially, that Bangladesh, the economy which has been, developing and growing more than 6% on average.
Your audio is not clear. Your voice is
can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay. I hope you all can hear me well.
Yes. You are clearly speaking. Yeah.
Okay. So one thing what you found that this RMG model of export success, and that the Bangladesh economy has been performing very well over the last almost 3 decades, especially in particular over the last 1.5 decades with respect to the economic growth. It's on average more than 6% of growth. And 2 factors have been really very, some of the very contributing factors. One is the export growth of ready-made garments. Another one is the ready-made on the remittance. So we are not talking about ready-mades, but though, again, that is also very much related to labor export and also very much exploitative in nature with respect to its, different dimensions. But let's not discuss on the remittance part. But on these ready-made garments, citing the success of this, especially the way it grew, its export, and it contributed to the economic growth, policymakers and the elites, especially the business elites as well, they termed it as a kind of RMG model of success. Now, what is this? What is actually driving behind this RMG model of success? Because it is okay. One side is definitely the growth, export growth, but on the other side, we also heard that, and that's very much, very, very rightly pointed out by Rahul when he was presenting the margin, that there was a kind of margin and the kind of so-called official margin. It shows that it's not that very high. And then it was kind of probably declined by the introduction of technology and other related stuff. But the argument is that probably the ready-made garments owners in Bangladesh, and then subsequently which has been transferred to the global monopsony, they actually, it's not the simple margin or the low margin which is being generated. In effect, and you also rightly pointed out, the kind of subsidies, the reverse subsidies, and in actually our analysis, we tried to emphasize more on the use of word the rent, which is much higher than the stated margins. So that actually made the incentive structure in the economy heavily biased towards the ready-made garments. So the entrepreneurs in Bangladesh in the last 3 decades, they actually found these sectors heavily attractive, and then they invested in this sector quite a lot. You know that our export basket is heavily concentrated. More than 85% of our exports comes from ready-made garments, and also more than 50% of the value addition in the manufacturing sector is actually coming from ready-made garments, and more than 60% of the employment in the manufacturing sector is actually coming from ready-made garments and textiles. Now, we should not also forget that what are the sources of these rents? You mentioned about the labor and the kind of exploitative nature of the labor, especially the use of labor, especially you mentioned the difference between the wage paid, actual wage paid and the living wage, and try to figure out some of the some ideas about that what could be the reverse subsidies coming out from by exploiting the labor, by not paying them the living wage. But if you can add some other aspects, especially that Bangladesh, though not India, probably India to some extent in the earlier days, definitely when the MFA regime was there, but Bangladesh was heavily benefited from the multi-fiber arrangement, especially the quota. And if you look at the development, the story of ready-made garments in Bangladesh, in 70s, we were only the jute exporters. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Bangladesh started exporting ready-made garments. And because there was a Korean investment came in, and we were using the quotas and the Korean investors, they're also supporting, this. And then this quota regime helped quite a lot for Bangladesh ready-made garment sector to flourish. At the same time, when you are talking about these margins or the kind of rent which are being generated, and Bangladesh is a beneficiary of the ready-made garments, is a beneficiary of duty-free market access in one of the major markets, European Union, and some major markets as well, especially also India, when India also started giving duty-free market access since 2011. So I think we should not also forget that it's not only the living wage and the difference between living wage and the actual wage, but also the global trading system and some of the system of preferences, which are also Bangladesh is a beneficiary of it, and especially the garments exporters, that also contribute quite a lot to the generation of this rents. Now, I think one important aspect, I think that's what I really try to add to this ongoing discussion, is that this sector in Bangladesh, and especially the farms in the ready-made garments and the entrepreneurs, they are also heavily benefited or supported by the political elites with respect to having a kind of stable political settlement. I actually did not see that kind of analysis in that book, and I would really love to hear from the authors. What were the kind of institutional space? When you were talking about this global monopsony and the linking it to the local labor, what is the kind of institutional space? What are the kind of political settlement there? And how the political settlement was maintained? Remember, in Bangladesh, the minimum wage for the ready-made garment sector was not revised for more than 1.5 decades. So, it is impossible to believe that in ready-made garment sector, it was a protected sector. Trade union was not allowed there. Probably things were different in India because labor laws and regulations, which are important factors, while we are talking about these issues, the local labor laws and rules and regulations, where we can see there is a marked difference between Bangladesh and India, where Bangladesh actually, the government, whoever in power, in the political parties, irrespective of who are in power, they actually maintain that political settlement, that they did not disturb that, what I call the labor regime, that not to allow minimum wage to increase, and it was there for years. So especially after huge protests and huge, movement, escalated movement from garments workers, then it was revised. And then you also know that is one aspect. Another aspect which is also very important is that the poor factory compliance, poor working condition. And the Rana Plaza accident and several other accidents where the factory inspection were very poor. Especially that was also part of the kind of so-called political settlement where political elites or the government, they were just closing their eyes that not to look at what is happening in the garments factories with respect to working condition or compliance, whether they have proper fire extinguisher or their proper working condition or proper setup there. So these things also added, this actually reduced cost for the garments owners or the factory owners, that contributed quite a lot. They could also generate rent out of it. So I think this discussion on this political settlement and the kind of whole institutional dynamics behind it really played very important role in maintaining the kind of status quo where the rent were generated, and of course in your language I can also say the reverse subsidies were kind of generated, and with that and the monopsony capitalism and with respect who came as a kind of buyer, they could also, when they bargained with these firms and the governments, they could actually transfer the burden to the workers because the whole political settlement was in favor of them. I think we should not forget that part. Now, another thing which was, I'm not quite sure whether which was present in India, but that was very, very present in Bangladesh, and which got highly disrupted after the Rana Plaza event. That is called the subcontracting process. Because the government's owner, one factory, they got a contract, and they subcontracted small firms, and probably the firm which got the contract, they are compliant probably, but the subcontracting firms, they are not compliant, and they are probably working, or they have the factories within a very residential place, and they are not really under any scanner of government supervision. So what happened there? Their exploitation in those subcontracting firms, or working conditions in those subcontracting firms, were terrible. And actually the whole Rana Plaza or the fire incidents or several other accidents which happened, actually many of them happened in those subcontracting firms. So that is, I think, very, very, one important point.
Summarize in 2 minutes.
Yes, I'll just conclude by saying that now, when you are talking about this whole pressure, and especially on this ready-made garment sector, especially the whole, one fundamental question is that how sustainable this RMG model is. And then one important pressure which is coming out, I think that I will pose back the question back to the author. Definitely the model what is there, and in your book very nicely you mentioned that global monopsony and the labor and the very exploitative nature of the use of labor by having these reverse subsidies, and it's kind of sustainable in nature. But then these kind of accidents, but after, especially after Rana Plaza in Bangladesh 2013, then there was a global attention to this labor conditions in Bangladesh. The whole European Union and the buyers, they actually formed two important alliances, Accord and Alliance. They actually they inspected all the factories. So the emphasis was not on the wage, but emphasis was very much on the factory condition and several other working conditions. So that actually over the last, since 2013, over the last 9 years, many factories actually were closed down because of poor compliance, because of these inspections. And then my point is that this factory compliance, adhering to the factory compliance and the pressure on the garments manufacturers did not actually emerge emerge locally or domestically, because the workers were not strong enough to put pressure on the garments owners. As you know that 80% of the garments workers 20 or 30 years back were female. Now it has come down to around 60%, and they have the problem, or they lack the strength to put pressure on the garments owners to increase their wages or increase or adhering to the factory compliance. What really worked was the global pressure, and especially EU's threat to withhold the GSP and other issues. I think we need to also think about and look at these issues as well, the global issues, the domestic issues, the dynamics, as well as the whole political settlement and the institutional space. I think that can actually give a complete story out of it. But again, I thank the authors, and excellent work, excellent addition to the literature. And I would really, love to, recommend this work to my students and the co-researchers. I really look forward to a wide readership of this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raihan, for, beautifully summarizing the book, as well as sharing your practical experience or your scholarly experience from your own country, which you have examined over a long period of time. I think that the stability of the policy in terms of reverse subsidies is fundamentally based on the political elites which you have and business elites where they have joined together, and there is a gridlock between the business elites and political elites as well as with the global capital, and perhaps that is reinforcing all these kind of things which you have very rightly pointed out and made a very valuable addition to the discussion today. So we are really grateful to you. Thank you very much. I think that now we have time for questions from the audience, and audience is very important, and anyone who is having question to the authors or to the the discussants can do. But first, Professor Charan Singh.
Thank you so much. This is such an excellent book. The theme is very good and great learning there. From what I understand from what the author spoke, as well as what the discussant said. Now, I just had a very basic question. If the authors or the discussants would know that this is simply restricted only to the garment industry, or they have done the case study of garment industry, but it is relevant for other industries too. That'll be very interesting to know. Secondly, when you talk of wages which are not competitive enough or lower than the average, you have in mind you are doing the comparison with international wages, or you doing the comparison with local wages. Say, for example, if I am a worker in the garment factory in a village in Delhi, you are doing a comparison with me. If I was working in the same village, in the same village on, say, leather industry. So when you say that I'm being exploited vis-a-vis what is the benchmark on which you say that I'm being exploited by the third point, which I think probably Selim mentioned, and I've not been able to understand it. As you know, that this is a fact which is known to quite a few of us, that the industry from the advanced Western world makes inroads into the emerging countries to exploit the wage differentials. That's exactly how JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs picks up employees from IIMs rather than pick up from Harvard Business School. And if they pick up from the Harvard Business School, they pay about 5 times more. And if they pick up from IIM Bangalore, much less. So, and then they polish them for a year or two and put them in the same jobs where they would have put a Harvard Business School child. So, is that phenomena? Is your study a replica or a reflection of that phenomena, please?
Thank you, Dr. Chan. We can take another question from Dr. Jaspreet Kaur. Dr. Jaspreet, you can unmute and ask the question. Anybody else would like to ask any question? No, I think that now you can respond to the first authors will respond to Dr. Charan Singh and then the speakers. Yes, please. Dr. Sukhpal.
Speakers means the discussants.
Discussant, yes.
I think maybe we should start with that and then come to Charan's question, yeah?
No, there will be two things. One is that the discussants have raised some questions about the additional things which you were expected to cover have not covered, some issues they have raised. Would you like to respond to them as well? If you
Yeah.
So then you can respond to that also.
Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a question, please? I'm Indira Hirve.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes, you are expected to ask questions. Yes.
So I have a question that when you are talking about these manufacturers, there are layers of manufacturers. There are large-scale modern manufacturers who ultimately come down to subcontracting to workers, and that is the way they exploit those workers. There are small-scale workers, and there are other kinds of workers. So subcontracting is done at 2-3 levels, and workers also, these informal workers also are at different layers. So they are informal, they are sweatshop workers, they are home-based workers, and so on and so forth. So if you consider this hierarchy, then I think perhaps the worst would be the home-based workers. So I think it will be a good idea to have this hierarchy of workers also in mind, to understand how reverse subsidies are changing with the layers of informality of workers and informality of producers. Because those who collaborate technologically with higher level and with abroad, with taking care of the foreign collaborators, etc., they also ultimately end up in subcontracting to the smallest unit, or to informal workers, or to home-based workers in for very unskilled kind of jobs like packing and this and that, etc. So I think that one has to see the whole problem of this reverse subsidies in terms of hierarchy of producers and hierarchy of workers. That will be more revealing of the situation. Because I had an opportunity to do this study, and I did such a study long ago for the ILO, where I distinguished between how large-scale producers behave, how medium-scale producers behave, and how small-scale producers behave in this, and how ultimately all of them go to the bottom for the lowest kind of unskilled work. That is the kind of value chain in which they operate.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Indra Hirve. I think there is another question by Priyanshi. She has asked a question: do you think green tax, like by European Union, can help the situation to some extent? So I think that enough questions have come, so we can ask Professor Raihan to kindly respond to the questions, especially by Charan Singh and this question raised by Priyanshi.
Unfortunately, I think I missed the question. I can come later if after hearing from the authors, please.
Mr. Rahul.
I think you have to unmute, Rahul.
Unmute, please.
I'm sorry. So coming to Dr. Charan's question on specifically on wages, on what wages we have actually compared, there are two levels of comparison which happens in the book. One is that we actually compare the wages which are being given to the living wages of the particular country, which has been formulated thanks to the research or the living wage compilation done by Asia Floor Wage. So living wages as Asia Floor Wage, I mean, in their compilation as defined as wages which is required to support a family of 3 while one person is working, which will enable them to lead a dignified life, which will cover their food, non-food, housing, clothing, expenditure. So one comparison was with living wages, and then within the text, we have actually done analysis from the microdata where we have actually compared across industries, across different, educational levels or from different locations, and have seen at how wages have been paid. So this is compiled from the Periodic Labor Force Unit records from India, which again, I mean, which proves that, like, I mean, by virtue of you being in a graduate, like a person being a graduate or above, the virtue of them being in garments or leather industry actually drives the wages down. So you know, this extractive industry has a this particular industry has a sticky floor for wages. I mean, wages are not rising beyond a point. So that is how the wages have been actually compared and said that, okay, the wages paid are low. Yeah, Sukhpal, if you want to add.
Yeah, I would say that the query by Charan that is this kind of understanding also applicable to other value chains? Yes, it is very much. In fact, we are already thinking of applying it to agro-food value chains in terms of looking at the extent and nature and dynamics of reverse subsidies in that sector. So it's very much relevant. So it's a very generic framework which can be applied in many situations. So that, should I go ahead, Professor Lakhwinder Singh, with other comments?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Indra Hirve's comment, I think, very important in terms of looking at layers of workers, not only workers, but also different producers, right up to the raw material producers. Yes, we mentioned briefly in terms of categories of workers being informal, casual, temporary, permanent, migrant, women, and so on. So these layers also sometimes overlap. Yeah. So it is very much there, and precariousness increases as you move down the value. That's why we are including the household. There are a lot of home-based work, which also combines with women's reproductive roles and helping production by others. So it's very much there. Maybe we didn't go into that kind of worker category-wise detail of who sort of gets what kind of below living wage kind of compensation. But that is the, in fact, I have done a kind of labor value chain of cotton seed production in Gujarat, where the layer of hiring even farm workers for doing cross-pollination in cotton seed production, where there are layers of even contractors, mates, or whatever labor contractors in terms of interstate migration, as well as handling of this worker who stay on farm for months together. So there is this layering, there is this chain of even engaging workers at different levels with different levels of exploitation or precarity of work. Definitely it is there. One needs to maybe use this term of hierarchy of work and workers and producers. Yes, that is always the case, that the smaller entity has lower bargaining power and therefore is prone to more exploitation by the parties which deal with it, interface it. So far as the two discussants comments are concerned, I'm really thankful to both of them, because they really brought very fresh perspective. Dr. Vasavi, I think she just took our limited, you can say, analysis of doing it within the value chain framework to a much larger level of questioning the very processes of development and paradigm of development. So that was really a refreshing kind of take on our work. But I think we are also mindful of the fact that we are talking about solution, because she was referring to deglobalization and many such other kind of larger alternatives to the neoclassical understanding of growth and development. Our concern in this book is more to deal with issues as if value chains are here to stay. We are not dismissing this. We are saying if 70% trade happens through value chains, then you just can't push them away. Yeah. So we may talk of great transformation, but we are also being very realistic and pragmatic in terms of what is before us. So we have taken that perspective that if we have to work with these existing systems of production and trade, how do we make them more bearable for the smaller entities, whether producers or workers? So that's where I think we sort of position our analysis, rather than talking about alternative paradigm of development altogether. That'd be a much larger story to talk about. The other, I think, comment from Professor Vasavi, which I found very valuable, is I think that is one way forward, that because she referred to this slow food movement. And since we are also talking about fast fashion in garments, I think there is a parallel. There is a parallel of creating alternative ways of cushioning some of the issues in this sector. So we can talk of slow fashion maybe instead of fast fashion, and that can kind of play some role in terms of making lives more sort of decent, work and life more decent in this sector or any other sector which operates through global value chains. So far as Dr. Raihan's comments are concerned, I think he also sort of gave us a more realistic perspective from Bangladesh, saying we may be critical of some of these types of exploitation, but should also look at the other side of the story, that what if these global value chains were not there? What would have been the alternative for Bangladesh? Yeah, so I think that is the thing we are keeping in mind. That's why we are talking about working within the chains to make them more affordable for everyone involved there, so that we don't sort of throw the baby out with the bath water. So that's where I think we are being more pragmatic in terms of our approach. But I would also say there that, though he didn't directly refer to it, but when he was talking about pressure from brands help the working conditions and wages improve, and he referred to the lack of bargaining power with the workers. Now that is happening largely because of two factors. One is called the structural power of workers, other is called associational power of workers. And this has been well discussed in the literature, that workers are not in a position to organize and stop work and demand better work conditions or compensation, because they're not organized enough because of the placement of workers within households as home-based workers or under subcontracting piece rate work or whatever. And if they're not able to stop work, therefore they can't make an impact on the chain drivers. Similarly, when they are not unionized enough, they can't even fight against this exploitation as an agitation and as a kind of movement. So that is what is complicating and letting the processes not improve as fast in terms of decent wages or decent income for workers of various kinds. And there, I think we would still say that this role of the state, which he refers to indirectly as soft state in Bangladesh, or business friendly state, which is the case in India as well, that we don't want to really spoil the show by asking brands to perform at a certain level, which can help workers and farmers. So that there, I think we are still saying that cannot continue. If the state has to play a pro-poor kind of growth paradigm role in this kind of sector, then you have to tighten the screw in terms of regulatory processes. Regulation should not only be adequate on paper, but also should be enforced on the ground. So that role of the state cannot be wished away. State has to play that role as a stakeholder in the development process, whether in garments or agri or any other sector of the economy which has prevalence of value chains. So I think I'll stop with my response here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sukhpal. We have Professor Vasavi to say something. I request Professor Vasavi to kindly take 2 minutes and speak about the issue which you have just flagged on the chat.
Yeah, thank you. I think both Professor Raihan mentioned it as Sukhpal now, so I just feel to respond to that. I think we've come to a time when looking at dominant systems as inevitable will not get us anywhere. We need to really look at alternatives, but those cannot be they can't be imposed overnight. Many of the dominant ones need to be phased out, and much more work needs to be done on the alternatives. So I just wanted to caution on that. And the thing about all sorts of economic activities, they're small islands of now alternatives, and I think those need to be legitimized much more. They need to be given more credit and to be reviewed. So I think going back to, or just say looking at in this case the garment global garment industry with this global value chain, etc., has an alternative, because if that wasn't there, there's what is available is worse. I think it continuously goes back to this whole argument of inevitability and this is a lack of options, and I think we need to come out of that frame. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vasavi. Now I think that Dr. Selim Raihan to speak. Please, 2 minutes.
Thank you. No, thank you. I'll not take 2 minutes. I think there is a question on do you think green tax like by you can help the situation to some extent? I think the question is related to this environmental cost.
Right.
There is a discussion in Bangladesh on imposing green tax and also the way, whether the kind of feasibility of imposing that. And in the book, actually, it was referred on the Buriganga, that is small river which got really polluted. It's not only for the garments, but also the tannery was also next to it, and then the tannery has recently been shifted, but still that river is very heavily polluted. But I think one discussion what is there, and I think that is something mentioned by Professor Sukhpal, is that the role of the state, whether they want to be the business friendly in such a way which is not really uh, conducive for the welfare of the labor or at the cost of the labor, and which is not really sustainable at the end. So in that case, this green tax, again, the discussion was that whether that will add cost to this business elite. So because there are strong lobbies in Bangladesh to avoid this kind of taxes, and we haven't seen much political will there to avoid this kind of lobbies. So I think this will be very, very important. The kind of the bargaining or how political elite they become kind of independent of the pressure from the business elites. And in fact, in Bangladesh, many political elites, they have so much, I probably to some extent in India too, in parliament, more than 50% actually they represent the business. The member of parliaments are actually, they belong to some business elites. So I think the policies and some of the steps which are taken, they don't really want to destroy or make change in the status quo. I think this will be very, very important in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Charan, you want to say something, or
Yes, actually, I had a supplement question, and if you permit me, can I ask that?
Okay, yes.
My question was a very interesting study, and therefore I'm thinking about it. The question is that despite such low wages as was shown by Dr. Rahul, is it because these are unskilled labor? Because in automobiles you will need skilled labor. So is this the unskilled labor? How does it compare with the Manrega wages that are prevalent in the same village? And finally, what would be the cost if this family had to migrate to the urban area, if it is unskilled? If they have to migrate to the urban area and look for an employment, because migration involves cost and living in a city involves cost. So their decision to continue in this is based on logic and economic factors rather than no alternative. So any such, and when you make policy for the future, one can really look at the cost benefit analysis of continuing at such a low wage, gives them permanence, unlike Manrega. And if they're discounted for the migration into urban area, maybe it turns out to be higher.
Thank you, Charan. I think that Rahul has to, intervene.
Yeah. Hi. Sir, I mean, now, okay, coming to the question of the skill level of the labor, you look at, I mean, look, as a proxy for the skill level, we have actually looked at the educational qualification. So you took, I mean, the difference is a below 10 standard individual who works in garment industry and an IT industry, the wage gap is around 4,000 rupees per month. So below 10 standard of educational institution, which will most higher probability of that worker being unskilled in that sense. And then even with an increase in education in the garment industry, I mean, it's not going up. I mean, a graduate or above educated worker in the garment industry is actually earning only, I mean, even less than half of the wages an IT industry is earning. And this typically stems, our argument is that this typically stems from the nature of the industry itself. IT as a sector has more bargaining power with the global capital than garment industry or the suppliers in the garment industry. The lead firms can actually shop through the entire South Asia for their products. But then the IT firms in India or elsewhere, they have some sense of, they have some level of leverage or bargaining power with their clients. For instance, TCS or Infosys does not take up projects which I mean, they upfront say that, okay, our margin out of this project will be 25 or more percentage. But then that kind of bargaining power is not present with the suppliers from the global south on garments. Actually, that position of the suppliers is actually driving down the wages. I think that's the argument which we are trying to, and that is actually the monopsony power exhibited, or that is where this monopsony power is actually in play in this entire value chain. That is the argument which is, and that needs to be broken. I mean, if you have to break that, that needs to be broken, and that will actually help us in driving up the wages. And I also would like to have a small response to the green tax question raised. I mean, if I may.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So it's again, see, the question is who's going to pay the tax, whether it's a lead firm who's going to pay the tax or whether it's a supplier who's going to pay the tax. If it's a supplier or the manufacturers in the global south who's going to pay the tax, this is not going to help. Lead firm, again, if the lead firm has to pay the tax,
Right.
but then our argument is that the way in which the business is actually done doesn't change. They'll pay the tax, and that tax also will be extracted from the production centers here. So until and unless you change the way in which the value chains are organized and is functioning, these regulatory measures probably will be reactionary in nature. I mean, it won't make change. I mean, sorry for being skeptical.
Thank you very much. I have just to conclude with saying two things. One is that the kind of discussions took place in the last 1.5 hours period of time clearly shows that this book has ignited the minds of various scholars participating and those who will read the book. This is highly valuable new addition to our knowledge, and I think that this is a very provocative book, both for the business as well as policymakers, and it is relatively talking about the interests of the deprived section of the society in the global south, and hitting at the very dominant global value chains which are having a chains of exploitative ways and means and pull production process or linkage wherever there is a pressure from the labor to try to get enhancement in the wages. So I think that is a mechanism which has been used for a long period of time to press the wages to remain depressed. And I think that is a fundamental ways through which this book has very systematically argued that the various ways through which the exploitation of the labor gender and then the farmers who are growing cotton and the workers working in the cotton fields. So you'll find that it's a multi-layered kind of processes through which it is very difficult to establish the link. So I think the congratulations to all the authors for especially bringing out less researched area to the much focus in the mainstream to talk about all this. So I think that this discussion will continue at the homes where we have been sitting and when interacting with our students and all that. So with these words, I appreciate and congratulate all the authors as well as the EGROW Foundation for choosing this book to be discussed at this juncture, and the publisher, especially the Cambridge, deserves congratulations for all this and my appreciation. And I also grateful to both the authors, those who have made very succinct presentations, very precise, valued presentation to introduce the book, as well as they have also attended to the queries, both of the discussants as well as of the question raised from the general public. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Vasavi for bringing out a very important alternative perspective, and Professor Selim, Raihan giving the practical advice and asking the authors and the people, scholars who are participating here, when you have to conduct a future analysis, you have to bring in the political and business elites which are in a gridlock with the global value chains. And that is the kind of policy perspective where you will find that if you have to understand this book greatly contributed in all this. And I am grateful to all of you for especially adhering to time limit, and that has allowed us to make these discussions very vibrant. Thank you very much. Handed over to Dr. Cha.
First of all, let me thank Professor Lakhwinder Gill for having chaired the session so efficiently. I want to also thank the speakers, firstly the authors who have presented their book to us on the EGROW Foundation. Excellent book, excellent hypothesis. If they do the other follow-up study, as Professor Sukhpal was mentioning, we would welcome you to present that also at EGROW. Such analytical rigor that you have brought in the book is very interesting. It's inspiring for Indians. It's also inspiring for sectors in which, and as trade associations in which these sectors belong. So I must thank you for that. Now, I must thank the participants for the questions they have asked on a Friday evening. I have an important announcement to make. First one, the recording of today's presentation will be available by noon tomorrow. I would welcome you to listen to it on such an important topic. People keep talking about income inequalities within the country and within nations. And here is a clear example of exploitation, which is happening. You wear the best clothes, but the supply chain suggests that somebody down the line has done the reverse subsidy, and therefore it needs global attention. So the recording will be available tomorrow by noon. Next week, same time, we have a discussion on a very interesting topic. You all may like to join, for the topic is so interesting. We are discussing about developing the economy of Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is 1/5 of our country. The population is nearly 20%. I think 6 to 7 European countries would fill in the population of UP alone itself. And UP is so massive and the market is so large. How do you develop it? And if India wants to become a $5 trillion economy, then we have to think of UP becoming at least a $1 trillion economy. So therefore, next week, we will have 2 academics and 2 bureaucrats to discuss how to develop the economy of Uttar Pradesh. Same time, I would welcome you to please join us, contribute your thoughts. We are all going to be thinking aloud of what can be the strategies, what can be the policies to develop Uttar Pradesh. And if Uttar Pradesh develops, you can well imagine India develops. With this, once again, let me thank each one of you for having participated in today's discussion and made the discussion very interesting and lively. Thank you.
Professor Charan Singh, from author side, I would like to thank Professor Lakhwinder Singh, you, EGROW Foundation, Dr. Vasavi, Dr. Selim, and all others who listened and participated in this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank
All of
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.